distant skies, firefight calls, the stakes are high. On the flame, heroes and spies, control fire, where strategy lies. Hear the tales, fierce and deep, victors roar, defeated weep. We blaze a way, we don't hold back, control fire, ready to attack.
Hello and welcome to Controlled Fire, episode 11. I'm Luke.
I'm Sam.
I'm Mike.
And this time we're going to be talking about terrain, what the types are, and more importantly, how they can change how the game plays around them, and tips and tricks for using terrain to your advantage. Before we dive into it, how about some From the Forge? Sam, what have you been up to?
Well, I'm getting ready for full con, so I am grinding out my half-painted Astarians. These are ones I got years ago. I have now finished off all my ciphers. I still have some tucked away in a case, but they're all special and heavy weapons. I'm never going to field that many. All the wardens and all the Knoll rifle ciphers are all painted. I'm halfway through a whole batch of marionettes. Next, it's jumping into the vehicles so I can get my transports and my spectra, get them all painted up in readiness. How about you?
Well, I've been knocking out some ice elementals for Kings of War, building a Blood Bowl team as well, just for funsies. And I also just dug out a bunch of my, they're primed and underpainted commandos ready to go, but I am ripping the arms off them to build some scrappers.
That sounds amazing.
For me, I've been working on them for a while now. The Nightstalkers, I finally built them all. I painted about a combination of 80 scarecrows and spectres, but I love some of the models I've fallen in love with, absolutely fallen in love with. I'm afraid to paint them because I don't want to mess them up. Between the Reapers and the Dread Fiend and the Void Lurker, the models are just plain awesome, and I'm really enjoying it.
I can't wait to see them on the table.
Awesome.
For full con?
I don't know if I'll have them ready for full con. It's more to do with the basing more than anything else at this point, but I could probably be able to get them painted, but I don't know if I'll have them based at that point.
I believe in you. How are you going to base them?
Because of the mainly two-tone grey and red, and I was going to kind of do them like in a blackish, gravelish type base and potentially red foliage around or something along those lines. So I have to get to the hobby store and have a good look around and see what's available to suit what's actually there.
Yeah, right. I think Gig Gaming Scenic's Grim Dark Rubble is perfect for what you're going for. And also, I'm quite partial to the Green Stuff World Neon Tufts. They you can get them in a variety of colours, and that sounds like it might really pop.
Particularly if you're going with a more muted scheme on the Nightstalkers, then the bases really pop. Yeah,
and it's so easy. You paint the bases black. you stick some. I use a matte Mod Podge, not PVA, matte Mod Podge to stick down the Grimdark Rubble. You stick a couple of tufts on there, and you're done. Call it a day.
I hate to say, but anything that makes it easier is fine by me.
All right, shall we chat on the new Marauder Scrappers? So this is something we're very excited about. It's a unit which has just come to the vault. It's been the first new Firefight unit to drop in about a year, I guess, or more. I guess since we saw the Nightstalkers hit the scene, that was a whole new army landing. And we saw some new stuff come through for the Astarians with the new Matsudan stuff. But I think since then, this might be the first new unit.
I think it's also the first unit that we've ever seen that hasn't come with a new list beer.
Yes, that's true. So it's a beta-only unit within the existing Marauder list. We thought we'd have a quick chat on it because we've already done the Marauder faction review and we wouldn't get a chance to chat about them. So the Marauder Salvage Engineers. They are a 70-point troop unit for the Marauders. They got 5s pretty well across the board. They got standard commando stats. They are only allowed to have 5 models in a unit. They come with advanced training, resilient 1, unflinching, and they've got both controlled fire and countercharge as their charge reactions. Probably the most notable thing about the unit is that they're just armed with pistols, except they've also got thermobaric grenades, which are a range 6 weapon, which I think is probably the shortest range weapon we've seen, but they're all 2D, blast D2 and pinning. What do you think of them, Luke?
Yeah, I really like them. I think they're great. I do like to run a unit or two of so far brawlers in mules and run them up to, claim objectives early and get in the opponent's face. And I think these are the perfect unit to swap in for those. At least one in a mule, maybe two. I might give two a go and see how that goes. When you're jumping out of a mule, range 6 isn't going to hurt you too much. With the pinning and the blast, I think they're just going to mince things up close. And the whole issue with charging out of a mule now doesn't matter if you're hopping out to shoot, right? So you get that first round in of shooting, pin some stuff. And really, I think the key with these guys is the range 6 blasty 2 pinning is fantastic, but coming with advanced training, controlled fire, and unflinching means that when you're up the field, getting in the opponent's face and being a nuisance, you're not really worried about a lot of other things that are going on. If you're going to get charged because you jumped out at the end of a turn and then they activate and charge you, well, controlled fire is just going to pin them and blast and do some hurt. If they happen to pin you before you can act, unflinching still lets you charge in. I think they're just great.
I can probably take or leave the unflinching, because that only affects if I'm planning on charging. And I guess I see these guys, they prefer to be mobile grenadiers, just running in and lobbing grenades at people.
The thing though with the unflinching, right, is that I often use brawlers on the subsequent rounds to do things like, if I think I can force that unit to be activated by getting an extra wound and then they can do back to me, I want to charge, even if I'm not going to kill the unit, or even if in this case the shooting might do a couple more wounds. Sometimes it's just about denying the activation of a unit. So I think the unflinching lets them still fulfill that role. And with the advanced training, they obviously not when they're pinned, but in other cases they can be shooting on 3s at range 6.
It feels like they are purpose built to have can't miss trigger on them. With advanced training, they can be on the other side of the board and then have the level 3 version of can't miss, so they are shooting on 3s with those 2D blasty 2 pinning grenades. And of course the leader has a plasma cutter, which is also range 6. 2D AP2, and whenever they aren't in range to be plasma cutting, also has smoke bombs, which he can just smoke the unit with to give them a little bit of cover, because of course when there are only 5 models, 1 wound each, they're only armor 5, a resilient 1, but still they might not be hanging around too long.
I mean, even if you are within range to shoot with them, you still might want a smoke bomb. He's got targeting systems, so he can target himself with the smoke bombs while the rest of the unit shoots at someone else. That's pretty key. And it's not a one use only. It's a self only, but it's not a one use. So they could be sitting on an objective against someone like GCPS that's probably not going to charge them, but might be shooting at them a lot. The rest of the guys can shoot 6 inches and he can smoke for the extra cover and they can hit the dirt.
Mm-hmm. It's worth noting that although they've got the pistols and the grenades, they've also got that little asterisk next to it, which if you look it up in the book says you have to pick between the weapons. So you can't both fire a pistol and lob a grenade in the same shooting phase. You're going to have to pick. And of course, if you're in range for the 6, you're always going to be picking the grenade.
Exactly.
Do you think you're always going to take a mule with these guys?
I don't see a point in taking the unit without a mule. They're just too flimsy. With only 5 bodies, 5, even with resilient 1, they don't have the long range to reach out and touch things. They're just going to be walking up the board and they're going to be shot. They're going to be the prime target to not get within range if they're walking up the board. You could move them into a building and maybe hold one of those, but that's so situational. I think you want the option of a mule.
I mean, I will say moving into a building, because you gain defensible, which we'll chat about later in the episode, but getting defensible when you've got controlled fire and these kind of grenades, that's...
Yeah, it's a great option for them. It's probably one of the prime things I'll be looking to do with them on the board, but you're not always going to get that good situation. With a mule, you're pretty much always going to get that situation, right? You can get them into whatever building you want. I just think the insurance policy of a mule, or 2 units in a Wolverine, that seems right.
Considering the Wolverine, unlike the mule, seems very much built for sprinting up and then people advance out and shoot. And this is a unit that you want to advance out and shoot with.
Yes.
They also have options for a breaching axe, which is upgrading their weapons from 2D to 2D AP2 seismic for 5 points. They also do drop their pistol, though, in order to carry it. They've got the Thorgarim plague. Do you see yourself taking the axes?
I think you've got to play at least one just because it's so cool.
Yeah.
So every unit should come with one, so it's now a 75-point unit. The model's quite cool, and I like the cinematic aspect of it. Well, there's a case for 4, right? But as always, someone's going to die at some point. You'd rather someone cheap die than someone expensive. I think 1 or 2 is probably fine. That still gives you 2 12-inch shots with a pistol to try and drop an extra wound on something. I'm kind of planning on maybe 1.
Because I figure by the time you've upgraded 4, that's 20 points. That's now a 90-point unit.
Yes.
If you're planning on just charging them in, couldn't they just be brawlers for a lot cheaper then?
Yeah, and look, if you've got to squeeze 5 points out somewhere, drop the axes. It's not that big a deal. But I'd like to play with 1 or 2, so I'll do them up.
I'm keen to see how they do on the board. Very exciting to have a new unit in the game.
Yes, and for a faction that I play.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if it's a Marauder model or a model from a different company altogether, but I think from memory last a Marauder was smoking a cigar, which would make a really cool model for the leader of the unit.
Yeah. The vault pieces do actually have a Marauder smoking a cigar as well.
Like you have a leader for the smoke. I think that'd be a really cool modelling opportunity for the...
Well, they've also, on the sprues, they've got someone, I think he's actually holding a bullet in his teeth, but it looks like it could be a cigar, so you could do something with that as well.
Yeah, I think that'd be a cool opportunity.
All right, Mike, would you like to take us through some of the terrain types?
Okay, so as we mentioned, this is an episode all about terrain and how it's going to interact on the table and things like that. So we're just going to go through briefly some of the basic types or classifications of the terrain, and we'll talk about some of their interactions between them. So the first one is plain, everyday, open terrain, which is pretty much the whole table before you put anything else down on it, or as I've referred to it, it's Siberia. So that's just the basic classification. There's no modifications of anything in the unit. It doesn't provide any cover. You can see everything and everywhere across the table. So the next one that we have is blocking terrain. So this is normally a large block of rocks. Could be anything you like, but basically you're making it to the point where normally most things have to move around that particular area of the table. So they can't climb over it. They can't end in it. There is an exception, of course, with flyers who can actually fly over the top as long as their base clears that blocking terrain as it goes over the top there. But normally most other units will not be able to go around that blocking terrain.
Yeah, I normally think of these sorts of blocking terrains as like statues or some big sort of focal piece things which you can't conceivably fit a mini onto and actually have it stand up. Neither can it be crewed like a building or anything like that. It makes no sense to move through it like a forest. It's a statue or whatever. So that's kind of what I think of for blocking terrain normally.
In the interest of simplicity, we probably don't want too many types. I like to use things like shipping containers as blocking terrain. Obviously, it makes sense to be able to stand on them because they're flat on the top, but it's just a thing you can't go into and you can't sort of see through and whatnot as well. So it would maybe be cool to have blocking that could be stood on, but I think it's an abstraction that's fine.
I actually think of shipping containers more like hills because they've got a flat top and they have a height to them. If you don't want to be actually having rolling landscapes and you want to be getting hills in your game, shipping containers probably fit the bill there nicely.
Yeah, if it's a big shipping container. I also, like in my set, I've got these ones that are a set of 3, and I put 2 down sort of in a line and then 1 in the middle on top of it, and we call it height 4 for the bit that is the stack on top, and then height 2 or whatever for the other 2. You can't go on it, although it kind of looks like you should be able to, but it's just a nice sort of way to add variety to the game.
Yeah, interesting. I guess I have the kind of headcanon of if a model can stand on it, it's probably a hill or something like that. If a model can't, it's going to be blocking.
One important thing about blocking though is especially people are coming from Kings of War who are blocking typically is infinite height. In Firefight, you actually do have to nominate a height for that blocking terrain.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually interesting to note as well in Firefight that there's no standard really for how high things are. I mean, there's a standard for buildings that, they should be sort of for each quote unquote floor, it's about height 4 and that counts in inches when it comes to moving up them. But there's no hard, fast standard about how big things are. So you really do need to go through with your opponent, in a friendly game at a table or whatever, go through with your opponent and nominate the heights of everything. And if you're looking at doing organized play, it's probably a good idea for the TO maybe to specify what the heights of everything on the table are before the game. If that's a standard map pack, then everyone plays on the same, which is very hard to do with everyone's eclectic collection of sci-fi terrain. But, maybe little markers or something on the table to go and nominate those heights.
It doesn't need to be standard, but it should be known before the game starts. It's much nicer that way than having a rude discovery midway through the game where people had different assumptions.
Yeah, and it's a really easy thing to go through with your opponent. You come to the table and you go, okay, first things first, what's everything's height? do we reckon this is capacity 15? Is that height 4? And just run through every piece of terrain so you're both on the same page.
We've been talking about a lot of different terrain types, and I think we only just started talking on blocking. What's next, Mike?
The difficult terrain. Difficult terrain is typically what you would describe as area terrain. It can be anything from craters or on the ground to a field, forests, or anything, pallets of goods and oil tins and things like that. So typically it's an area terrain. You're looking at the fact that your leader needs to be within that terrain and at least 50% of the unit to be able to start to claim cover. And if it wants to try to see out of that terrain or be seen, it needs to be within 3 inches of the edge. That is something that I've noticed that a lot of newer players miss, the 3-inch section from the area terrain. But the important thing again is generally, of course, in the craters, you're going to want to be nominating again what kind of height it is. Typically, from my point of view as a TO, I normally say when you're in the crater, it's height 1, but it doesn't actually block anything if someone's seeing over the top of it. So you're in the crater, you're getting a kind of a section in it. Same as with forests and what kind of things. If you've got pallets of goods sitting there, you need to nominate that kind of height.
Mm-hmm. The real key with what Mike just touched on there with the height of the essentially flat terrain is that the book does specify that flat terrain doesn't provide any
height
cover.
Zero.
Yeah, height
Yep.
0. When you're in it, when you're behind it, it doesn't provide any cover at all. It just hinders movement.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas
so like swamps and so on.
Yeah, but if you come from a Kings of War background, you're used to flat terrain providing cover if you are in the terrain.
Mm-hmm.
So you can stand in it and gain some level of cover as well. That was a great thing that I think Mike introduced to our organised play here, and I've taken that on myself as well, is that if anyone outside of the terrain, it counts as height 0. For anyone inside the terrain, it counts as height 1. And then that way it provides cover for things that are standing in it.
Now, interesting, because I know that, like, say if those craters are height 1, because the rules do specify that if the height of the terrain is below the height of the model, while you're in it, you do gain cover. So if you were saying that crater was height 1, say, then you would be able to see across the top of it, but I guess it would also be providing cover to things behind it as well.
Which is undesirable when it comes to those situations. So it's kind of this catch-22 as to whether you make it 0 or 1. Mm-hmm. And I think Mike's solution is great. As long as you put that in the pack if you're doing an organised event.
As long as everyone knows, right?
Yeah, same as lakes or, ponds, lakes, those sorts of things. We can go into them and you see straight across them, but it actually would provide cover when you're inside.
So I guess probably the major thing we'll note from difficult terrain is that it does hinder movement. So for the majority of units, if they want to be moving through, they can only be taking advance actions, and we'll look at different units with it which interact with it differently in a moment. But for the majority of units, if they're moving through difficult terrain, they can only advance. And if they are conducting any charges through that terrain, those charges are going to count as hindered.
Yeah, so how do you guys play on the table around these kinds of terrain?
I'll be using it as cover or blocking, depending upon what I want to use it for, and I guess where the objective is placed somewhere around that particular terrain. And normally, because I'm playing the Forge Fathers and Enforcers and a bit shootier, then they're kind of going to be using that as cover, if possible, to try to hinder the other people's advance, depending, going on an earlier episode about looking at the table and what that terrain is and where they're going to try to get to and whether or not that terrain is going to be causing them issues. I guess I'd be looking at whether I'm going to deploy or not.
I mean, I know a tactic which is used frequently against me with difficult terrain is a unit being placed within that 3-inch lip around the edge of the terrain. They're shooting out of it, and while they're doing so, they're in cover. That's fine. But then as soon as I start to get a little bit too close, they shoot and then step back. And because they've walked back behind that 3-inch lip, I now can't target them. It's immensely frustrating because, of course, their action next turn is to step back into that lip late in the round in order to fire back at me. It's absolutely something you can do in terms of strike and fade around the lip of an area terrain piece.
Even for smaller pieces, you can just sort of sit behind the terrain and do the same thing. And basically, when you're on the other side of the tall, difficult terrain, it basically functions like blocking terrain for line of sight. So you can do the same sort of thing, even with sort of narrower pieces.
One thing that I do like when people try that, though, is although it's blocking terrain for line of sight for shooting, you can still charge straight through it. I may not have line of sight, and so I'll cop the penalty for an unsighted charge. Just because I can't shoot you doesn't mean I can't run through it and hit you.
And because it's unsighted, it'll be hindered anyway, so you're not getting any more negative from the terrain.
Probably the most common type on the table, or at least should be, as we'll get to that later on down the line, is obstacles. Mm-hmm. These are your fences, your sandbags, your barricades, all those sorts of things, or I guess sometimes piles of rubble can be on there, and they're usually restricted to height 1, and the unit, if it's standing in right next to that obstacle, does not take a penalty for shooting over top of it, but it'll give cover for something trying to shoot back at them again.
Yeah, so your leader has to be touching the obstacle. That doesn't provide cover for you shooting things over it, but other things still get the cover negative to shoot you.
Yeah, I mean, I do love the simplicity of how they've defined obstacles for Firefight. That they're all height 1, they're all relatively small, there's going to be a lot of them on the board, and this is how they work. It's wonderful that so much of the battlefield scatter, regardless of what it looks like, follows very similar rules.
The other type is the hill. Not necessarily seen so commonly on a firefight table, not on the photos that I've seen. But they're typically height 3 per level. So the general infantry normally can't see over them until they actually start to move onto the hill.
You have feelings on hills, Luke, as I understand.
I mean, I think you don't see them very often because they're boring. They're a worse building, right? Because a building you can kind of walk on like a hill, or you can hop into it and sort of do other things with it. It feels weird to not have them because they're in every other war game that I think I've ever played, but they're just, I don't know, they take up space on the table. They count as one of your terrain pieces that you're putting down, but they're just so boring. They don't add a whole lot to the game. And every time they've been on a table that I've played on, I've just felt like they give someone a massive advantage and not the other person. I don't know, they're boring.
Obviously, I mean, there is play you can do with hills. Moving up onto the top of them, shooting, and then your height will be extended. You'll be able to see over the tops of other things and not be copping cover penalties, just with the downside that more things are then able to see you because that's now your height as well. And also because it is of such a height, you can then step back off the hill in order to give yourself some screening. I mean, there's play there.
Yeah, but they don't have the downside of walking onto a building, which is the movement penalty to get up there. There's no tactics around walking up onto a hill and shooting off it. Whereas there's tactics around, getting up on a building and doing the same.
You're just doing the trade-off of I want to be able to see more things and with fewer penalties, but more things are going to be seeing me and with fewer penalties.
Yeah, and if you're playing the long-range super shooting army, then that's just a massive advantage for no real downside.
It's true.
But, they exist as a terrain type. They're fine. Play them if you want to play them. I just think they're boring.
Buildings. Fortunately, the rules aren't particularly clear on buildings, so we're just trying to clarify them here once again. All buildings actually do offer the rule defensible, but the fortified versions give you an extra point of armor. But the downside of the fortified building, as mentioned in an earlier episode, is each capacity 5 rating that the building is, only 2 models can shoot. How do you guys like your buildings?
Oh, all the time. I mean, they're going to be on every board, right?
Yes.
They're integral to the game.
They are. And they're a very interesting piece as opposed to hills because they are, in one go, a blocking terrain, a hill, and an area terrain.
Oh, and effectively a vehicle, right, that you can shoot out of.
Yep, they are multiple things, which makes them interesting. Pretty much all with their own downsides. So they're a hill, but it takes movement to get up there. They're blocking, but someone can just walk into the building and shoot you from point blank range. Being in a building, yeah, sure, you can see out and shoot a lot of things, but a lot of things can see you and shoot you now. Like, it's really cool because they are lots of things, but there's always pros and cons to those things that they are.
No, I 100% agree.
With the fortified buildings, yeah, like the only 2 models shooting for every 5 capacity, it sounds like it hurts, but people have got these multi-story buildings and they go, well, I guess it's a pretty big building, so it's going to have a pretty big capacity. I'm seeing people say, oh, that looks like a capacity 20 building right there, whereas we used to say that's 2 10s. So capacity 20 building with a 10-person squad in there is still shooting out with 8. That's totally fine. There's no real downside to that.
I was just going to say, I was very curious because it actually says in the rule book to not put hills in deployment zones, but it doesn't say that about buildings. What do you guys think about that? To me, it seems like that's a holdover from Kings of War, where you don't put hills in there, but I don't understand why it doesn't specify for buildings.
I mean, I can understand it for hills because, as Luke says, they don't really have downsides like buildings do. Whenever I'm putting buildings in, I don't mind if a building overhangs into the deployment zone, as long as it hangs out, because that means that then units can't start the game deployed in the building because part of the building extends beyond the deployment zone. They can go on the roof, roof if there's a roof there, but they come with their own downsides.
Yeah, I always put the buildings so that they're overlapping the deployment zone, but not wholly in. But I also don't think that it's a huge problem to have them wholly in. One of the reasons you don't want to kill in your deployment zone is because you can put a tank on it, right? And that tank with 48 inches can sit there and shoot across like almost the entirety of the board. That's a lot more difficult to do with a building, right?
Yes.
I think that's one of the reasons why, hills specifically are probably a bad idea.
In deployment zones. Yeah.
And in general.
I will say, for a bit of a review of traps and tricks around buildings, I do recommend going and having a listen to our gotchas, quirks, and oft overlooked rules episode. We actually do a little bit of a deep dive into a lot of the common pitfalls of using buildings in that episode.
Yeah, we'd just be rehashing a lot of that episode to go through the tips and tricks with buildings here. But go and listen to that. There is a lot of play around buildings that you can have.
I'll just briefly mention fortified terrain. It does say in the book it's mainly for narrative missions. And fortified terrain is basically your trenches, fortified defences. It also has particular rules for barbed wire and things like that if you wanted to have those in your battlefield and you wanted to use them. Personally, I don't think it doesn't need to be limited to narrative, but I guess it's all up to you what you wish to do. But generally, a fortified terrain like the trenches and so forth will also, like a building, give you the defensible keyword to the unit that happens to be in them.
I had actually thought in the past about some cool trench rules you could do, but I think they could be quite a unique terrain. But just having the ability to have those kinds. If you've got a trench crusade board and you want to place a firefight on it, the rules are there. You can do it. Anyone in a trench gains
defensible.
Yeah. So all of these terrain types can hinder visibility and cover. So should we have a bit of a chat about how they affect visibility and cover?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think probably the major thing is that, as we've been saying, they all have a height. And while things are at the same height as the unit, it's going to be blocking line of sight. If it is a lower height that separates the unit and whatever it's shooting at, so if you have a height 2 unit shooting at a height 3 unit and there's a height 1 obstacle in the middle, it's going to be giving partial line of sight. If the majority of whatever you're shooting at has only partial line of sight going to it, the unit is termed to be in cover and you're going to have a -1 for shooting at it. So it does call out if there is a great difference in height, that line of sight is clear. There's actually a bit of a discrepancy between what's in command protocols and what's in the companion rules. The command protocols book says if there is a height at 4 levels or greater than any other unit or terrain the line crosses, line of sight is clear. Within the companion, it says the same thing, except it's a height at 3 levels or greater than any other unit or terrain the line crosses, line of sight is clear. Admittedly, later in the companion, in the big target section, it does also call out a height differential of 4. We normally play with a height differential of 3 giving clear line of sight, because that's in the line of sight section in the companion, which is the current rules. But we really should get a clarification on this in a published errata or FAQ, I hope.
Like I said, we've all been playing it as 3 because if you ignore the big targets rule, it says 3 in the companion, and that's what we base our gameplay off. But when you start comparing and looking at the book versus the companion, it does start to feel like it's meant to be 4, and maybe the 3 was a typo going into the companion, but we have no way of knowing at the moment. So this, as you said, it does need an FAQ or errata. And I think as long as everyone's clear on whether you're playing it as 3 or 4, it doesn't really matter because everyone's going to play it the same way.
Probably the most useful height differential, I think, is height 4 and height 1. The reason being there are a lot of height 4 units, like most of your tanks and big vehicles. They're all height 4, which means they are shooting over the top of obstacles, which are height 1. That means that all of your tanks, aside from things like difficult terrain and buildings, they should be drawing clear beads across most of the battlefield. Similarly, most things should be drawing clear beads on them because the obstacles are not providing them cover.
Yeah, and remember that you check both the target and the shooter to check the heights. So if either of them is at least 3 or more over, then there's no cover. So a height 2 shooting over a height 1 at a tank, for example, no cover because the tank is over height 3. And, obviously, conversely, if both of them are less than the height, then obviously they can't see. Anything else in between those two is cover. So speaking of cover, again, we'll refer you back to the Gotchas and Quirks episode that we did. There is something that you can do to play around with cover a little bit, and that's the trick of having your leader out and being able to see the enemy, but over half of your unit then hiding behind something to gain cover. And, that can be a bit of a trick or a hack to get cover, even though your leader doesn't have any cover to shoot the opposition, but still having cover when being shot at. But there are other ways to play around this as well. I've done things where I move a unit up and I kind of position the unit. I'm not gaming sort of hiding behind a building or anything, but I'm just positioning a unit and sort of drawing a bead from opposing leaders, and then making sure that from that unit, if I put these guys there, they're behind this obstacle, and if I put these other guys over, poke them around this other side, then I'm getting cover against that other unit as well, because there's another piece of terrain that helps me get that benefit. So don't just put your leader down and go, oh, and here's my massive bodies around them. Kind of look and go, well, where can I put the bodies so that I can get the most cover possible from people shooting at me?
Well, in terms of oft-overlooked rules, you just called out one to me that I wasn't even aware of, in terms of you can't do that kind of stuff with hills.
Yes, that's right. The hills specifically say that you have to put the whole unit on the hill if you are able to, which I believe used to be in the rules for difficult terrain, because I remember I watched a video of people explaining the game when this game first came out, Firefight 2. They said that they missed that as a rule when they were playing, and they hadn't done that in the game, but that was actually a rule. I think that might have been removed in this version, maybe for simplicity, in favor of the at least 50% to be in cover. Possibly because some units don't fit in pieces of terrain, and it kind of got a bit quirky if they didn't sort of clarify that. So it's probably for good reason. But the hills still have the section that says everyone has to be on the hill if at all possible, which means if you've got a big enough unit and a small enough hill, you can't put 2 units on that hill.
Also, since we've been chatting as well, I've kind of revised my view on shipping containers being hills, because, of course, as you just mentioned before, vehicles can go on them, and there is no way you're driving a tank up on top of one of those, right? So...
Yeah, that's interesting. So I've got a couple of the city terrain pieces still sitting in a box, ready for me to get the space, but I want to make a city board out of them. And my plan was to use some of the buildings with boarded up windows and say they're hills. You can't go in them. Let's treat them as hills. But that is an interesting problem now.
Yeah, vehicles can drive on them.
Maybe I can model some rubble around so it kind of creates a ramp so that vehicles can get up on the building.
Just want to clarify, we were talking about units before and what can go in there, single model units. So anything with a 60mm base or larger, then you're talking about a 50% of that particular base needs to be in or out of that terrain. And your vehicles we were just talking about a second ago, because it doesn't have a base. Again, you're normally looking at how much of that percentage, that model, you can actually see.
Yeah, so there's, I'll draw your attention to page 20 of the Command Protocols book, or if you've got the companion, there's a section called Types of Terrain, and you're going to find 2 very important tables. And I'm kind of glad that these tables exist, because otherwise you're kind of like trying to read through and sort of parse out combinations of terrain and vehicle movement types. So these tables give a really quick, good reconnoiter over how to treat different terrain types with different units and keywords.
It's a very simple way to engage with it.
Yes. So it does split into 2 sections, because vehicles with different keywords function differently to other units with those keywords. And also you'll note that fly only exists now for vehicles, because everyone that's not a vehicle that could fly now has anti-grav instead, because that was easier. The non-vehicle unit types can be on foot or other. So that's just if they don't have a special movement rule, this is how they treat the terrain. So they basically treat all of the difficult and obstacle types as difficult terrain, which means they can't sprint through them, and they get hindered charges when charging through them, but they can make an advance through them. And they treat blocking terrain as blocking, as does everybody. Let's not talk about blocking anymore. Blocking is blocking. You can't see through it. You can't move through it. You can't land in it unless you're flying, in which case you can fly over it but not land on it. So blocking is blocking, except when it's not, and when it's not is when you fly. And next we have wheeled. So wheeled vehicles and non-vehicles are treated the same. So these are things like your bikes, your mules, those sorts of things that have wheels for motion. So they treat obstacles and difficult terrain of height 0 or 1 as difficult, and they treat difficult height 2 or more as blocking. So mules and bikes cannot go into a forest, but they can drive through some swampland.
But take a movement penalty to do so.
Yes, and the penalty is no sprinting.
Yes.
They can move, advance at full speed, but they just can't sprint through it. The mules can still go 12 inches over an obstacle.
And probably gain a bit of air in doing so.
They turn into a flyer.
Shall we chat on tracked?
Yeah, so tracked are a vehicle only. So there's no tracked non-vehicle units, which is interesting. They treat obstacles and flat.
There is a tracked non-vehicle unit, but I imagine it probably has to be dealt with in other. Inferno Drill is a tracked.
Is that really?
It is a tracked construct.
There you go. I guess it is other. An Inferno Drill can't sprint through difficult terrain.
It's speed 9 anyway.
Well, that's interesting. Okay, so there you go. So there is tracked non-vehicles, but we only have the table for tracked vehicles. So yeah, obstacles and flat difficult, so height 0 or 1. It's open ground, so they can sprint just fine through those terrain types, and then blocking for height 2+ difficult and blocking terrain. Then we've got anti-grav. Anti-grav non-vehicles treat obstacles and all kinds of difficult terrain as open ground, so can sprint through it. Whereas anti-grav vehicles treat obstacles and flat difficult as open, but height 2+ as blocking.
Yeah, which is a bit interesting because it means that your Asterian skimmers and so on, they see a forest and there's nothing they can do about it.
Yeah, and we've all seen the speeder bikes in Star Wars crush into trees, so it's not like they're completely impervious to difficult terrain.
Except that's an anti-grav non-vehicle.
Yeah, exactly. That's
so
what I mean.
They can go over the top.
But they treat it as open ground, whereas they should hit trees.
Yeah, I mean, I do find it interesting that on this chart, effectively tracked and anti-grav are identical for vehicles.
For vehicles, yes.
It's a bit interesting that your grinding over obstacles tanks are just as capable of handling terrain as something which would be flying over it.
Next is Walker, and they have the same thing where non-vehicle and vehicle walkers have the same rules. So obstacles they treat as open ground, but then just like on foot or other, they treat the difficult terrain types as difficult. So it's really just obstacles that walkers can ignore.
It's also worth calling out that walkers are also the only vehicle which are allowed to assault units inside a building. They can't go into the building, but they are the only vehicle that is allowed to assault a unit in a building.
Yeah, so Striders and Iron Ancestors and whatnot.
Yeah, Spectra.
And the last type we have is Fly, and everything to them is open ground as long as they don't land on a piece of blocking terrain.
Yeah, they can fly freely over blocking terrain, just can't land on it.
Yes. So I think the key takeaway for all of these is basically really that vehicles can't go into height 2+ difficult terrain, except for walkers. The others sort of just more augment whether or not they can sprint through something or not. Mm-hmm. So it's just about what you can sprint through, and then for the case of vehicles, can they go into difficult terrain? And obviously wheeled vehicles as well can't go into tall difficult.
It is nice that it's effectively something is going to be either open, difficult, or blocking.
Yes.
And depending on what particular keyword you have, that's how you're going to be treating the terrain.
Yes, and no one can move through blocking except flyers. So that's its own special rule for flyers. But then other than that, everything just follows these. Everything is open ground, difficult, or blocking. And if it's blocking for you, you can't go through it at all, into it or through it. And if it's difficult, you just can't sprint through it.
So it's probably worth calling out for anti-grav in there, because I know people who might be coming from Kings, that they might think it operates like Fly, and that Fly ignores terrain, but then you land in terrain and suddenly you need to have Pathfinder in order to not copper hindered. Anti-grav just treats that entirely as open ground. You can charge units in difficult terrain and not be hindered, assuming you had line of sight to them.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to getting my Void Lurker to the table.
I bet. So we might now do a bit of an unpacking of some of the specific keywords that interact in some ways with terrain, so we get a bit of a picture of all the different ways we can be interacting with terrain. So if we pick some of the deployment-based keywords, a scout. When you're taking your scout move, you ignore difficult terrain for the purposes of the scout move, and you may not enter a building as part of that scout move. Similarly, for aerial and subterranean deployment, when you're coming onto the board, you may only emerge or land in an area of open ground, so you can't go into difficult terrain. The only exception is aerial deployment. You may land on a building roof if that exists. We might quickly touch on some of the movement-related keywords beyond the ones we've just had, and that's sure-footed and teleport.
So sure-footed reads that a unit with this keyword may ignore the effects of a hindered charge when charging into, out of, or through difficult terrain, or when charging over an obstacle. So this is a great ability on some units, particularly those cheaper, fast beast-type units that kind of need a bit of a help somewhere. But it's worth noting that it only affects charges, not other kinds of movement. And the two noteworthy exceptions to this are that they don't negate the -1 for unsighted charges. So it doesn't also remove the hindered from those unsighted charges either, which includes from a transport or a building.
Yep.
So sure-footed specifically calls out terrain types that it's charging through on or over as being not hindering to them, but it doesn't say that they're not hindered by an unsighted charge. So they still don't get the +1 for that charge, and they get the -1 for the unsighted, just as everyone else does.
Yeah, but if your charge is crossing obstacles or you're charging through a forest at a unit that you can see, you're not going to cop any penalties. That's going to be a +1 to hit for a proper charge there.
Yes. But teleport, on the other hand, does remove all hinders. So it reads, a unit with this keyword may ignore terrain rules and enemy unit proximity when moving. So just when doing any kind of move, it can come within an inch for its movement, and any other terrain rules like blocking. They can teleport to the other side of blocking. They can teleport onto a roof and not pay the penalty for having to move up the side of the roof, that sort of stuff. When charging, the unit may also ignore the effects of a hindered charge, and enemy units contacted may not make an assault reaction even if eligible. And the final placement of the unit must still form coherency and be 1 inch further away from other units unless initiating an assault.
The teleport is a very strong rule that exists on one unit in the game.
But you can get it on something else.
You can get it on Asterians, and we'll chat on that when we come to orders.
Yeah, but again, this doesn't remove the -1 for unsighted, but it does ignore the hinder. Because unsighted says get the -1 and it's a hindered charge, but this says you don't get hindered. So, if you hit on 4s, you would hit on 5s for the unsighted charge, but then you would get the unhindered charge and go back down to 4s.
Let's chat on some of the shooting keywords that interact with terrain. I'm calling out It Burns and Psychic.
Yeah, so It Burns and Psychic are kind of similar in that they both basically don't suffer from any negatives due to cover and other modifiers. And It Burns additionally always hits on 4s, which is very nice. Psychic has the additional benefit, though, of not requiring line of sight and not having penalties for that not line of sight either, like Indirect does, which is really great when paired with playing around blocking terrain, buildings, and tall difficult, that sort of stuff. So you can move up, be completely covered, not visible to the enemy whatsoever, and shooting things on the other side of a wall.
That sounds like Nightstalkers. It's Nightstalkers who have most of the psychic stuff, right?
They do. There is a sprinkling of psychic stuff in other armies, like
Veermen.
Yep. Yeah, primarily it is Nightstalkers, but it's really cool, and I think it adds a way to play the game that's different, that adds uniqueness to those units.
You looking forward to getting your Nightstalkers to the board, Mike, and you can start trying out some psychic?
Yes, I'm looking forward to hiding behind a building or some piece of blocking terrain and then shooting the living daylights out of something on the other side. Yes, looking forward to bringing that terror to someone on the tabletop soon.
How many banshees?
I have 1 banshee and I have 3 mind screeches currently.
Nice. All the psychic.
Yep.
And for some additional keywords, can I call that defensible? Because we've chatted on that one a bit, and that all buildings grant defensible, so I think it's worth calling out. Bulky. We know bulky means that those units are not able to enter buildings. They are able to assault units in buildings in the same way as walker vehicles are. They just can't then occupy the building. And inspiring. What are we thinking of for inspiring there?
Just that if you're in a building in particular, that inspiring doesn't expand out of the building like it used to.
It is interesting, though, that there are keywords that function similarly to inspiring or to command orders which aren't capped like that. Medic, for example. You could put a medic into a building and extend the medic bubble all the way around the building.
Interesting. It's not a special ability per se, but unit height does matter for buildings as well. Because if you are height 3 or more, you count as capacity 2 for occupying buildings and transports. A height 3 that's not bulky can still go into a building, but only half as many. If it's a small building and a big enough unit, you might not actually fit.
We might chat now about some of the orders that interact with terrain. We'll begin with one we've chatted on before in our Marauder faction review. I've had it played against me and it hurts. Explosive rounds. Luke, how does this one run?
Well, against you, it doesn't.
I'm sorry.
every time I shot with it, everything missed.
I'm just remembering getting charged by a big unit of grunt bots, all of them with AT weapons, and I'm in a building. That was not a lot of blast weapons that I wanted to be eating.
Yeah, so it's a Marauder order. It only costs 1, which is fine because it's situational. It says the unit gains Blast D2 on all its anti-tank weapons when targeting any unit within a building or wholly within an area of difficult terrain with a height of 2 or more. I have used this quite a bit on my stunt bots. I don't tend to run things with anti-tank melee like the grunt bots, but on my stunt bots, because they've got 4 shots that are all anti-tank, I use it wherever I possibly can, and sometimes on hulks as well. The real key with playing against this is just like don't put things into terrain that you think they're going to want to shoot with their anti-tank. Like they've got the order, just don't put your Iron Ancestor in terrain because it's going to get shot. I think if Marauder Commandos ever get that double special weapon treatment that they're starting to put into a lot of the armies, where if
please let that come to marionettes.
So if you've got more than an X amount in the unit that you can have 2 special weapons, I think if that ever happens, 2 missile launchers in the Commandos becomes a really good option for this because they're anti-tank. They've got no blast or whatever. They're just AP2, 2 dice, AP2, anti-aircraft, anti-tank. So to have a unit with 2 of those in it, being able to then just shoot at infantry that are in terrain, because infantry are always in terrain, the cowards. You'll get the blast. That seems fantastic, and I would love for that to be a thing.
Another Marauder order I might quickly call out as well is Heavy Metal Rampage. That's on the Raider command vehicle. That's one that gives your Walker units sure-footed, which is a bit of an interesting one, because as we've just unpacked Walker units, they already treat obstacles as open ground and difficult terrain of any height as difficult. Is there any advantage in also giving them sure-footed? Because sure-footed means that on the charge, they're going to also be ignoring that difficult terrain.
I don't know.
Walker's still considered area terrain as difficult.
Yes, that's right.
But they can still charge into it for free anyway.
Yeah, it's not hindered.
But it's normally considered to be hindered.
Yeah, so
it's no longer hindered.
Yeah, so I guess it's taking a unit which is already ignoring the obstacles. It's really just there for charging into difficult terrain.
Yeah, it's difficult terrain. That's fun.
But it could also charge into the building. You can't go into the building, but it can assault the building. It wouldn't be hindered on that either.
Sure-footed? Does sure-footed ignore buildings?
No.
Okay. It doesn't.
And now we come to the Asterian order, which we alluded to before, that gives units teleport. So the Asterian order reposition. So this is an order that level 1 applies to the units with the construct and walker keywords only. When they perform an advance action, they gain the teleport keyword. At its level 1, I think this is not a terribly useful order. It either needs to be blocking terrain that you're looking to get round to the other side of. About the only use case, as I've had pointed out to me, is to teleport onto a building roof, in which case maybe then it's worth spending 1 command point to move up on top there. The level 2 version is not terrible, because then you can do it as part of a sprint action, which means you can then teleport into a charge. And as we were discussing, that means you're ignoring all the difficult terrain between you and the opponent, and they're not getting a charge reaction. I don't know if I've ever triggered this at level 1. Level 2, occasionally, if I want to deprive someone of a charge reaction.
Oh, not just the charges, though, because the number of times I've been sitting a unit in terrain, I'm 12 inches away from an objective, and I'm like, I can't run out onto that objective to claim it right at the end, because I'm standing in difficult terrain. If I could just teleport onto it, that's huge.
Absolutely, because just the ability to spend 2 in order to ignore difficult terrain on a unit for an objective claim, sometimes that's useful.
When you spend 4 inches of your movement getting up on top of a building for a single-story building, or 8 inches for a double-story building, being able to just teleport up on top and shoot is huge as a 1 point.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm very sad that I'm pointing that out just before a tournament where you're playing
Asterians. Thank you.
I should have kept that one in the back pocket.
Excellent. What's the next order?
The other one is we covered it in the last podcast in Forge Father review, but it's the Earthshaker Irons, which allows a unit to ignore cover. It costs 2 to be able to do that, but if he's got a unit sitting in there and you need to get rid of it, 2 points. Okay, probably not the greatest thing. It's very expensive, but if you need to, then you got an option there to be able to do that.
I'm going to pull together a few orders across a few factions and deal with them all in one go. I want to chat on Bloodlust and Tenacious Advance. They're both Plague. Go, Go, Go in the Enforcers. Fire and Maneuver and Move Out from the GCPS. And the Expendables in Maison Labs. What unites all of these orders? They all provide a free advance action as part of their effect. The reason I wanted to call these ones out, in the vehicle rules, it specifically mentions that you can't use a free advance action that you get from an order to enter or exit a vehicle. I was very disappointed when I discovered this because I was very excited by the Plague Tenacious Advance order, which would allow you to take a free 3-inch advance move at the start of your activation. I thought I'd be able to hop out of a transport, and then I've then got a clear line of sight for a charge. I might even be unhindered. Very happy days. But that is not the rules, as I discovered. But it is the rules for buildings. It doesn't have the same rules in the building section as it has in the vehicles, prohibiting the free advance action you get in an order from entering or exiting a building. You can use these free advances for getting into or out of a building. That means for Plague, you can be hopping into a building in a turn, Tenacious advancing out and then charging for a line of sight clear charge. And you can also be doing the same sort of building, entering and exiting shenanigans with all of these orders that are in here, just not into and out of vehicles. That's the call out I wanted to make for these orders.
Or the same building and the same activation.
Correct.
So you can't go out of a building and back into it.
That's right.
Which is almost something, the same building, which is almost something you never want to do. But if you think about it, actually, if you could go out onto the roof to shoot with better height and then back into the building, that would be cool, but not allowed.
Or even just stepping out 6 inches, I'm now in range, and then hopping back in.
Shotguns.
Yeah, but
go.
no.
I like using it with the jet bikes, and I can just jump over the top of the building, shoot something, and then jump straight back over it again, or blocking terrain and you can't shoot me back.
Can't do it over a building or blocking terrain. Anti-grav can't go over blocking terrain.
Not over blocking.
Yeah.
So blocking. But over a building, yes.
No, but buildings count as blocking terrain.
No, you can go up and on it.
Oh, yeah, you can land on the roof of it, and that's fine.
No, but you can get up and go over it. Because you can walk, and if you have enough movement, you can walk up the side of a building, across it, and down the other side, right? Mm-hmm. But anti-grav ignore the up and down.
They ignore 4 inches.
Yes. So a single-story building, they can just go over it as if it's not there.
Yeah, I guess that's true. As long as it has a roof. If it's a pointy building, you can't.
If it has a roof section, then they can do it. If it doesn't, then they can't.
Yeah, interesting. Mike, did you want to lead us through the next section?
This one is generally a question that comes up quite often, particularly for new players in here, and that's simply how much terrain should I have on my table? Basically need to have around about 4 pieces of terrain and 4 obstacles for every 2 feet width that you have. So on a 4x4 table, you want to have 8 pieces of terrain and 8 obstacles. 6x4, you want to have 12 pieces of terrain and 12 obstacles on the table. The main things that I want to talk about there is attempting to, as much as possible, making sure that you haven't got a clear channel of fire from one edge of your deployment zone to the other across the table if you can. That is probably the biggest call out. Again, because the poor flyers, making sure that you have enough dedicated height on the table. Most flyers are at least height 6, so you need to have a fair amount of height on them.
Yeah, and that's why I like to have a forest, and I've got stackable buildings that I can make 1 or 2, so I always put a stack of 2 and a forest, essentially. So it's water towers, but it's basically a forest. I always have those 2 on the table just to provide those tall things with something they can hide behind.
Because you want to be having at least sort of height 4 or 5, so the flyers are getting cover, and you want to be having some that are at least height 6 or more in order so that they actually have some line of sight blocking.
Yes.
Because most anti-aircraft weapons in the game seem to be 36 inches, which means that it doesn't take much to reach out and drop a flyer.
Reach out and
Yeah, so you want to give those poor flyers somewhere to hide.
Yeah.
They're only going to have a few spots on the board where that's possible. But at least having a couple where it's there is kind to those flyers.
Double high hills, double high buildings, forests, those sorts of things. Make sure you've got a few pieces there for the person who does want to have a flyer in the game to be able to at least have a fighting chance.
And just so you can visualize it if you're not clear, we're all pretty familiar at this point with 2x2 feet. So, you've got 4 of those on a 4x4, and then you've got 6 of those on a 6x4. Those squares, control sections, and that sort of thing that we're used to. So just imagine 2 pieces of bigger terrain and 2 obstacles on each of those 2 foot by 2 foot squares. That's about how much density you have on your table.
So what sort of principles do you have for laying out boards? Do you think in terms of those 2 foot squares?
No, but I do try to have a bit of a spread out between the rear of your deployment zone and 2/3 of the way up your deployment zone. I don't tend to have much terrain at all they don't tend to interact with the game that much, so I kind of don't bother really with those backfield terrain pieces. It does end up a bit more, dense towards the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I prefer to have higher terrain in the middle of the table than to the edges of the table, if possible.
Tapering out.
Like goes up into a mountain range, if you like, with your level, your big stuff in the middle of the table.
Mm-hmm. And you've already mentioned, of course, making sure where possible that you're not allowing much in the way of firing lanes from one deployment zone edge to another.
Yes, because we talked about those things that have 36-inch range or 48-inch range, and it's going to hurt if it can sit back on its table edge and it can shoot across the table at you. So you want to try to avoid that as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, you want to make sure there are some firing lanes for us so they can take some advantage of their range, but they shouldn't just have clear shots everywhere.
Yeah, and that's mainly to help the assault armies because, they need help.
So when I'm laying out a board, I tend to take the bigger pieces, so not the obstacles, and I fairly evenly distribute those, but it is nice to push some things up closer to each other just for that variety. Having a forest that's sort of right next to a building can add interest to the gameplay, but not if every piece is butted up against each other, just, one or two maybe shift a little bit closer, but have them reasonably well distributed. And then I go around with the obstacles and I walk around both sides of the board and I place obstacles such that they're cutting down the majority of the firing lines that that are available. And you can only really get that perspective by sort of walking around both sides of the table and placing them. I do like to have some cover in the deployment zone, whether that's flat, difficult, or obstacles, or close to the line, so that things can sort of stand there behind for shooting or holding backfield objectives. Making sure that, if you've got a building at the table edge, maybe don't put it within sort of 4 inches of the table edge to allow vehicles to be able to run down the side if they want to, but maybe having obstacles there to, hinder their movement. Or if you are putting them there, at least have a way close by for them to get around. You don't want to completely cut off, a third of the board from the vehicle being.
I would love to be able to fit my vehicles through a 4-inch gap.
4 or so. Well, yeah. Don't play Asterians.
I agree with everything you're saying, and particularly with the putting things into deployment zones. I actually quite often like having things not just for cover, but those sort of difficult terrain pieces or buildings, which also then jut out of the deployment zone, just so people can't start in them. People can't just build a line; they need to think in terms of how am I going to work around these obstacles, which are in my deployment zone, and then those further ones up the table as well.
Yeah, and using things like buildings that someone might want to jump into, but often you're trying to avoid, to do things like break up your lines of advancement, so you have to split forces, or capitalize entirely on one side or the other. Just making for interesting decisions to be made. I
mean, one of the things I know we chatted about before in our Turn Zero episode is I do like having not wholly symmetrical setups, because I think, for a start, that makes it a little bit more dull, I think. But also, we know that as part of Turn Zero, someone gets to pick a table edge, and they're actually in some ways disadvantaged on an information gap for picking that. We need to make sure that's a meaningful choice. So you don't want to skew the deployment zones, but you don't want anything wholly symmetrical, otherwise you're robbing that person of something.
Yeah, and I think an easy way to achieve that is actually when you look at the variation possible in the terrain, like we said, they're not standard like in something like Kings of War. You can have height 8 buildings and height 4 buildings and height 6 difficult, and you can have hills, you can have all variety of terrain. Try making your terrain set have a lot of one-offs. Like I said, I've got one, quote unquote forest on my table. So that's going to go somewhere. And it's not going to go right in the very middle of the board. So that's instant disparity. Asymmetry, in terms of the deployments. Likewise, I'm only putting 1 2-story building down. So I can't have those mirrored. I have to put them somewhere, and that does cause that. So try having a variety of different pieces. It's more interesting to have the variety of different pieces, and it inherently builds that asymmetry into the board.
Yeah, 100%. It's the try not to have symmetrical. You're robbing a section of the game out with the command dice and who gets to choose the table edge. I built tables that have all the high stuff on one side and nothing on the left-hand side, for example, and things like that. Yeah, try not to keep them as symmetrical as you can, as asymmetrical as possible.
All right, and that wraps up the episode. How about we exit with an Overwatch? Sam, what are you looking forward to on the sci-fi horizon?
Well, with these Marauder Salvage Engineers, I am kind of looking forward to seeing some new units come through. I think it's just whet my appetite for seeing these sorts of things. I'm hoping the RC, who have done a great job with the Marauder Salvage Engineers, are minded to maybe do it for a few extra things that are in the vault. I mean, we've seen the Forge Father repair crews for a few months ago. They don't have any rules in any system. The Hornet drop clamp thing, I think, is a cool looking model. I think it'd be great if something like that. I know I've mentioned before I'd love to see Maison Labs getting the Void Touch mutants added as a unit in there, maybe giving them beasts and also some drones in there. I guess I'm excited for having had one new unit enter the game. What are the potentialities for some more?
Well, there's also the Goblin Dead Zone team that could make units, and the Vault Chasers, all those.
Vault Chasers, 100%.
Yeah. Mike?
Been busy again. We're doing tournament organising and things like that. So, as mentioned earlier, we have another tournament coming up at the beginning of April called FullCon. Well and truly booked out a long time ago now, which is fantastic to have an event booked out more than a month in advance. That was fantastic. Made me feel really good, and know people are very excited. And I also have a Dead Zone and Firefight come and play day that I organise on a monthly basis. That's held on the other side of Brisbane, but looking forward to running that again.
Yeah, I'm also looking forward to FullCon and losing to Sam in round 3 again. So yeah, that's coming up very soon, and I'm excited.
You can always make it round 1, guys. You just need to grudge each other and get it over and done with.
But that's on me if I want to, because you can't grudge down. You can only grudge up. So that's on me as to whether I do that or not.
Well, I mean, I think the Salvage Engineers are going to pull the game out for you.
Well, that's if I don't play rats.
Oh, I hope you play your rats. They look so good.
Yeah, I've got a UV torch that makes all the glowy bits glow, which is quite fun. So until next time, unbalance your battlefield, choose buildings over hills, and unleash controlled fire.
Hear the tales, fierce and deep. Victors roar.